Okay, hi everyone. So this is the last few minutes of chapter 17. I will try to also get chapter 41 done this weekend after all. So I'm hoping we shouldn't need to meet Monday evening. And if not, then those of you who are not taking the final, I had a great semester with you. And for those of you who will be taking the final, I've also had a good semester with you, and I will send out more information on the meeting time and kind of what to expect for the final exam. If you are taking the final, I would like a email at some point from you, just saying, yes, I'm planning to take the final so I can make sure I print enough copies and that I have everything ready and I kind of know how many people are going to be coming. So anyway, let's just jump right into where we left off in class. We left off here with allopatric speciation. So remember, speciation is just kind of an event that happens that could lead to the development of another species. In this case, allopatric speciation is referring to a speciation pattern in which a physical barrier that separates members of a population ends gene flow between them. So something changes and two groups of organisms are no longer allowed to encounter each other. Some kind of geographic barrier will separate them. So they used to have gene flow between two populations, but ultimately a geographic change happens and those two populations no longer can interact, and therefore they're no longer able to share alleles or genes. Then they will, with time, those two populations that were closely related and highly sharing at one time will start to diverge. Their genes will diverge, and this leads to the development of new species. So a geographic barrier will block gene flow, meaning that those genes no longer can cross. It can happen by swimming, walking, or flying. A mountain forms, a volcano forms, a chunk of island breaks off, anything like that. And it also can be determined based on how the organisms reproduce. So if it's through internal fertilization, meaning that they have to actually physically be near each other, or by pollen dispersal. So if the wind or some other organism like butterflies take pollen to a neighboring flowering plant in order to fertilize it, both how they travel and how they reproduce can be affected based on what the geographic barrier that develops could be. So here it says, when the Isthmus of Panama formed, it cut off gene flow among populations of aquatic organisms in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. Another example was something that was back in my hometown in South Texas, when they were talking about, and this is apolitical, I'm just discussing some of the environmental outcomes that people were concerned about. There is already a border fence between the US and Mexico, and it's relatively low, has lots of space between it, but it does prevent organisms that can't jump, organisms that can't fly too high, um, anything that can't get through kind of the grate in this fence. Let me see if I can share a picture while I'm talking about it. Um, you can always Google it. Just look up border fence in South Texas or something. But when there was a discussion of a border wall, something that wasn't being considered is the effect that that would have on native populations of butterflies. So butterflies, while they fly, they are not like birds where they can fly way above a wall, way above buildings. Some birds don't fly that high, but in general, they don't have the same flight patterns or flight ability that like a bird would have. And they're highly affected by the weather, highly affected by barriers. Obviously, if you've ever driven on a big open highway, you know that, and it's like butterfly season. I don't know if we get that up here, but you can really hit t dozens of butterflies just on your drive down the highway for 15, 20 minutes. So when you are considering building a wall that's potentially a couple stories high, that could separate the butterflies. And those butterflies fly fairly easily between the US and Mexico. So there would be a time potentially if there was a thick tall wall that the butterflies would no longer, we would cut off populations on the US side and populations on the Mexico side, and they would no longer be able to meet and would no longer be able to reproduce and ultimately could develop two different, as long as they survived, they could develop two different species if under enough pressure for enough time. And you can always look up butterfly species of South Texas. We're a big birding hub and we're a big butterfly hub. Um, excuse me. Here's another example of allopatric speciation in snapping shrimp. So this is that isthmus of Panama that was formed. It cut off gene flow in these ocean-dwelling populations, and now it's given rise to two different species. Um, they are reproductively isolated. So instead of mating when they're brought together, they snap their claws at one another aggressively. So even though they could interbreed, they now behave against each other and actually will fight each other. So now they've kind of driven this behavior change because of this isthmus that was built in Panama, or that happened in Panama. So also, if you think about the archipelagos, those are island chains formed by volcanoes, such as the Hawaiian and Galapagos Islands. You hear a lot about Galapagos tortoises and things like that. So archipelagos were populated by a few individuals of mainland species whose descendants diverged over time. So some of these little teeny tiny islands built by volcanoes actually were able to inhabit a few species, a few individual species, and then they were isolated again, isolated from the mainland or from their main populations. So then selection pressures within and between the islands can foster more divergences. The first birds to colonize the Hawaiian Islands found a near absence of competitors and predators and an abundance of rich and vacant habitats. So they were able to make lots of speciation. So there's this new lush place where some birds can go colonize and they're able to just live and survive and grow and not have predator or competitor problems. So in this case, honey creepers are a type of bird that we talked about earlier in this lesson that are unique to the Hawaiian Islands, have specialized bills and behaviors adapted to feed on insect seeds, fruit, nectar, and other foods. And these are all different kinds of, well, not all, many different kinds of Hawaiian honey creepers. The bills of these bird species are adapted to feed on insects, like we said. But also you can see there's some that are for insects, some that are for seeds, some that are for fruits, some that are for nectar in floral cups, and then there's other foods. So some of these here you can see have short, fine little beaks or thicker rounded beaks or long spindly beaks, or there's one here that looks almost like a parrot beak. And so there were all these different resources and they didn't have to compete with each other, but they were able to, some were able to thrive because they lived off of nectar and some were able to thrive because they lived off of insects and we were able to have these kind of speciation events. There is something called sympatric speciation, and that's when populations sometimes speciate without a physical barrier that bars gene flow, and can occur instantly with a change in chromosome number. Many plants are polyploid. So remember, we are diploid. Polyploid is just a way to say multiple gene or multiple chromosome. In this case, we're talking about wheat. So it's a mutation or a change in chromosome number. So some chromosomes found their way while they were separating during meiosis. Now there's extra chromosomes in kind of the offspring. So wheat experiences something called polyploidy, which is just multiple chromosomes. Common bred wheat results from a hybridization of a diploid and tetraploid species. So the wheat that we eat here is hybridized diploid, so 2 chromosome, and tetraploid 4 chromosome species that they hybridize. And so now there's just kind of multi chromosomes in these hybrid offspring. Also in Lake Victoria cichlids, there's a sexual selection thing here, so we'll talk a little more about it. But in the same lake, female cichlids of different species visually select and mate with brightly colored males of their own species. So here, males of four closely related species of cichlid native to Lake Victoria, Africa. Hundreds of cichlid species arose by sympatric speciation in this lake. Mutations in genes that affect females' perception of color, of ambient light, in deeper or shallow regions of the lake also affect their choice of mates. Female cichlids prefer to mate with brightly colored males of their own species. So these speciation events start to happen because maybe they noticed the male up near the surface of the water and it seemed very brightly colored because there was lots of sun. And so then those females chose those males, but then if say they're living a little deeper or it's a murkier time of year, or maybe there was a change in the environment that caused the ones that are brightly colored in clear water to not be so brightly colored in murky water. And so then the females are only able to see certain colors. Right now, they've changed the colors that they're able to see because there's less sunlight or there's less, or they're deeper in the water, or there's some sort of change in the not salinity, in the surrounding water, like how murky it is. So then they pick up on a different color and only breed with those males that are yellow or green or blue, depending on what's going on in the water around them. And so then for that breeding cycle, they'll only pick the blue males. And then for the next breeding cycle, they'll only pick the yellow males. And that's because of stuff that's happening around them. And that gives rise essentially to new species because all the males that were chosen were a completely different color, and maybe like we see here have now we're starting to give rise to ones that have slightly different head shapes or thickness of their fins or other traits that go along with being a blue color or a red color or so on. There's also something called parapatric speciation. This can occur when one population extends across a broad region with diverse habitats. So two species of velvet walking worm within overlapping habitats in Tasmania, they can interbreed, but they will have hybrids. So there might be a bunch of those hybridized, sterile, hybridized velvet walking worms because there's just enough males and females for that to happen and they have enough offspring. Um, but at the end of the day, those hybrid offspring, they're a new species for that time, but they obviously can't have their own offspring. It just comes when, so parapatric is related to the distance that some species may have a broad region. They can go into many, many diverse habitats. And so they might find something that they can breed with that is surprising or not what they've typically bred with. And so now there's new offspring because they've encountered a new similar enough species that they can now have new species offspring with. So talking a little bit about macroevolution, this is large scale evolution. There are 5 patterns of macroevolution. There's stasis, exaptation, mass extinction, adaptive radiation, and coevolution. Stasis is a lineage which persists for millions of years with little or no change. So here we're going to talk a little bit about the coelacanth. I took a lot of ichthyology and like fish study classes in college, and these are ancient lobe-finned fish. They're really fascinating. They are still around. They were rediscovered in the 30s, and they are these kind of chunky, monkey fish. They're thick. They have longer gestations. They have these lobed fins as opposed to ray fins. They have something called a rostral organ, and we can go into all of that if you're a fish person. But if you compare the ancestral fish, so 320 million year old coelacanth fossil, with a live coelacanth today, they'll be very similar. Um, Whereas other fish species will have changed a lot from that ancestral fish to now. The lobe-finned coelacanth still maintains a lot of that ancestral trait, a lot of those ancestral traits. There's acceptation. This is adaptation of an existing structure for a completely different purpose. So, like an evolutionary novelty. So, feathers on a modern bird used for flight evolved from feather on a dinosaur used for insulation. So, when I was a kid, and obviously, if you've seen any of the Jurassic Park movies, at least the old ones, you know that we thought that they were just lizards and had scales or scaly skin, rough skin. And of course, we now know that feathers are more than likely, the type of outer coating, right? That most dinosaurs would have had. Um, so feathers existed. They existed in ancestral species like dinosaurs, but they were used for a completely different purpose. Now they still can be used for insulation, but now they've been modified and changed and expanded, and the bird bodies have changed in order for flight to work in these feathered creatures as opposed to just insulation. So acceptation is adaptation of something that exists already, a change of something, some trait that exists, and it's going to have a new purpose, but it still exists. Mass extinctions are what they sound like, simultaneous losses of many lineages. We've had many of them throughout all of Earth's history. Extinct, remember, refers to a species that's been permanently lost. 99% of all species that have ever lived are now extinct. Um, Keep in mind that there's a lot of stuff that we can talk about as far as environmental science and our human like anthropogenic causes of extinctions, but there have been natural or at least non-human extinctions that have happened over time. Fossil records indicate that there have been more than 20 mass extinctions, five catastrophic events in which the majority of species on Earth disappeared. And so that's when we think about the floods or we think about the asteroids. We've heard kind of all of those theories over time. Adaptive radiation. So a lineage rapidly diversifies into several new species. So when there is a space, a niche, and something survives in this area, suddenly there's, again, like we saw with those honey creepers, there's lots of room for all of them to live and find their own place in that kind of bird society or in that area of new growth. So, a burst of genetic divergences can occur after individuals colonize a new environment that has a variety of different habitats with few or no competitors. And it can involve something called a key innovation, which is a new trait that allows its bearer to exploit a habitat more efficiently or in a novel way. So there's also something called coevolution. So this is joint evolution of two closely interacting species. It is what it sounds like. Two species that kind of grow, they work together or grow together, or they encounter each other in a way that means that one is going to survive alongside the other. Each is a selective agent for traits of the other, and then each adapts to changes in the other. So as one starts to evolve, another organism will evolve with it. Over evolutionary time, two species may become so interdependent that they cannot survive without each other. And the example of that is, I believe it's this, what did they say here? The large blue butterfly and the red ant. Um, so the caterpillar form of the butterfly interacts with the ant. The ant is preparing to carry the honey exuding hunched up caterpillar back to its nest, where the caterpillar will feed on ant larvae for the next 10 months until it becomes a pupa. So butterflies emerge from the pupae to feed, mate, and lay eggs on wild thyme flowers. Larvae that emerge from the eggs will survive only if a colony of the ants adopts them. So they're so closely co-evolved that the caterpillar builds up nectar on its back to attract the ant. The ant takes it home. The butterfly, the caterpillar then turns into a butterfly, goes through its process, its instars, and it's able to um, then survive by eating the larva. And so without the larva, the butterfly would no longer exist. Without that ant and the ant's larva, the butterfly would no longer exist. So they've continuously co-evolved over generations and generations of these two organisms. So evolutionary theory, biologists disagree about how macroevolution occurs. Dramatic jumps in morphology may be the result of mutations. Macroevolution may be an accumulation of micro events, or it could be an entirely different process. So discussing phylogeny. So instead of trying, I've been talking a bit about taxonomy and we've been talking a little bit about like family trees and these different ways to categorize all of these organisms that we know about and how they're interrelated, right? So instead of trying to divide the diversity of living organisms into a series of taxonomic ranks, most biologists focus on evolutionary connections. So this is phylogeny, grouping species based on the basis of their shared characters, like a genealogy. Each species bears traces of its own evolutionary history in its characters. And in this case, we're saying characters are quantifiable or heritable traits, so things that we can see or measure in some way. And by also, that would be our phenotypes, right? I guess we could use the genotypes in that concept, but it has to be something that we've studied and that we can quantify in science. Biologists group species on shared characters. So the base of the group is a derived trait, a character present in the group under the study, but not in the group's ancestors. So this is just kind of discussing how they group species. They have some shared characteristics or characters. There's some new trait, maybe like going from a lobe-finned fish to a ray-finned fish. There's a change there, a derived trait. There's still a fin. They still live in water. It's still used for balance or swimming. Um, but it's no longer seen in the coelacanth if you go far enough back into the ancestral coelacanth slash fish groups. So some characteristics here, or some characters here, would be being warm-blooded, having hair versus feathers. Do they lactate? So do they provide milk to their offspring? Do they have teeth? Do they have wings? Or do they have feathers? And you can see how these traits may vary based on which organisms we're comparing. So like a bird, a bat, and a lion share different traits based on what characters we are comparing. So this is getting into cladistics, making hypotheses about evolutionary relationships is the field of cladistics. Relationships are diagrammed in evolutionary trees. A cladogram is a visual summary of the hypothesis. So now we're getting into those trees that we've seen. An example of cladistics using something called parsimony analysis, which we won't cover in this class, with the characters. Let's see, they show three possible evolutionary pathways that could connect birds, bats, and lions. So this is showing on a tree, right? On a tree that we've seen, where traits started to develop in history. So warm-blooded must have developed before birds, lions, and bats existed. And then we start to say, well, maybe wings developed right after that. Is it possible that wings developed right away? Is it possible that wings developed independently? Is it possible that wings developed just before bats and birds diverged from this warm-blooded ancestor? So you usually go with the simplest one. The pathway most likely to be correct is C, the simplest, the one in which derived traits would have had to evolve the fewest number of times in total. So if ever you're looking at one of these trees, they're all going to be complicated, and this is still kind of a best guess or theory. So this is where we start to say, it looks like wings in a bat and wings in a bird might have developed independently of each other later down the line because it looks like teeth, milk, and hair are much more common and didn't have to be developed multiple times in multiple lineages. So when we talk about those Hawaiian honey creepers, to illustrate how evolution works, We know that they were isolated in those archipelagos and in those Hawaiian areas. Isolation spurred those adaptive radiations. So though there was a niche, there was lots of room, and so lots of species could develop very quickly. And it ensured that they had no built-in defenses against predators or diseases from the mainland. So they didn't have predators the way that the honey creepers would have had back at the mainland. And they also weren't encountering diseases in the same way. So specializations became hindrances when habitats suddenly changed or disappeared. This is discussing conservation of honey creepers, and it says here the Palila has an adaptation that allows it to feed on seeds of native Hawaiian plant, which are toxic to most other birds. That's a very unique trait to have developed, to eat toxic food and be able to process it, and then that becomes their primary food source. The one remaining Palila population is declining because these plants are being trampled by cows and eaten by sheep. Very dramatic words, gnawed to death by goats and sheep. Bringing in agriculture, bringing in farming has now changed the habitat for these creatures, and they are no for these honey creepers, for these Palila. And so they're not, their food sources are now greatly reduced. Um, That's funny. It's a very aggressive statement. It's true. It is being trampled by cows. And if you can see my screen and the little like thing at the bottom here, but goats and sheep and cows seem to be able to eat this, or at least are competing with the space of their food source. Letter B here, the unusual lower bill of the akiki points to one side, allowing it to pry open buds that harbor insects. So there was a bird that was born with a crooked beak, and it had ended up being advantageous to it being able to find food that other birds were not able to consume. And then this um, pu'uli is rare, old, and missing an eye. It died in 2004, and there were two other pu'uli alive at the time, but neither has been seen since. So that particular honey creeper species is gone or most likely extinct. So cladistics allows researchers to study the evolution of viruses and infectious agents. So the H5N1 influenza virus infects birds and other mammals. Phylogenetic analysis shows species jump from birds to pigs, with one isolates potentially transmittable to humans. Um, that's a lot of concept to put on one very simple slide. Um, Mostly, if we know a little bit about viruses, we know that they hijack an individual's metabolism, their cell metabolism, in order to make copies of self. So viruses are not alive, they're not considered alive. They interact with other cells, take over the machinery of those cells, and then use those cells to reproduce, to make more copies of their own viral DNA or RNA. So using some cladistics can help because sometimes we can pinpoint certain strips of DNA or RNA that are present in birds, or very similar to like a bird virus that we've encountered. Um, Say there's a person that develops a flu and they've never seen it before, but then it shows up in this research or in this process of trying to figure out what this flu is. They're able to say, oh, well, this looks like something similar in bird genetics. And then we can start to say, okay, well, where else would this strip of DNA or RNA have come from? And they can see if there was an originating animal species that this virus or that virus came from. That's a lot of words for something that you're not going to cover in this class, unfortunately. But just know that cladistics gives us groups of organisms that we can start to study and say, hey, we see a lot of bird flus going on. Let's see if we can preemptively strike and prevent them from jumping to humans or jumping to other organisms like pigs, or see how closely related they could be based on this process of studying how these organisms are interrelated and how traits are derived. So anyway, that is it for this chapter. Again, I will send out some announcements tomorrow and Monday. I'm hoping to get your last chapter recorded after all, hopefully tonight or tomorrow, and then we can hopefully just see each other for the final exam. And I will use Monday night to get everything else graded. So everybody enjoy your summer break. It's so weird to call it winter when it's time for summer. If you have any questions or concerns, again, I'm going to try to get a lot of your stuff uploaded this week. So if you have any questions, concerns, comments, or if you plan to take your final, the optional final, please let me know. Also, final disclaimer about exam 4. I will not do any late work for exam 4. If you miss exam 4, even for an extenuating circumstance, then just assume that you're going to take the final. I will give you access to exam 4 once it closes, and you are welcome to come take that optional final to replace your missing grade. But I cannot, with the deadlines and the dates that we've got, I cannot give people extensions and push exam 4 back any further. So it is open. Please let me know if you have any issues with it. Your best bet is to take it with enough time to let me know if you have any problems, and you'll be hearing from me. Have a good weekend.